Mr. Ferrara will be happy to entertain questions, so we open the floor to discussion. While you prepare yourselves to come forward, let me start the ball rolling, if I may. Mr. Ferrara, early in your address, you made an observation regarding, I think, the connection between social advancement and, I take it, economic development and constitutional reform. And I was wondering whether there's a sort of a chicken or egg relationship in that regard.
Well, as I mentioned in the address, I'm certainly not the first person to say this, and as I mentioned, it was dealt with in the constitutional report of 2005. Our history has really shown that where greater autonomy and self-governance is given to our own people, the territory has made significant strides. And those strides have been in many areas. And as I look around the room, I mean, a lot of us here would appreciate where the territory was in the 1950s and so on, and where we have come since then. And that is in no measure, no small measure, because our own people were given greater authority and greater say. And they had a vision for the development of the territory, which they sought to implement in many areas, including relating to social services. I mentioned the Social Security Act as one such area. So yes, I mean, it's an important phenomenon. It's one that we should be proud of. And it is one which I think, to some extent, is demonstrative of the psyche of the Virgin Islander as a proud and independent person, emboldened by the fact that historically we have owned land, and we must not underestimate the value of the ownership of land, not just from the economic terms, but also the sort of liberating effect and independence that comes with the ownership of property and having a stake in your own country.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, we invite you to come forward and engage Mr. Ferrara in discussion. Thank you. Dr. Dawson.
Thank you. I think time will tell, but I really think that this will be a landmark lecture as far as this territory is concerned, when we look not of the information you shared, but the things that you suggested, the principles you suggested going forward for this territory. And as Michael said, it is indeed very timely. One of the things that you mentioned in terms of freedom of information is always something that I look at, because I always feel that one of the weak spots in our democracy, as you will, going forward, one of the weak legs on the stool has been the press. The fact that the press, the media, is an opportunity to ensure greater accountability from our public officials, but I think that they have been stifled through the years as far as the information that's available to them. The piece that I would like to ask, though, as far as the question is concerned, you mentioned, and in answering the questions, and the issue of support for among OTs. And I would say certainly in the last year or two, if there was ever a case for support among OTs, the situation in Turks and Caicos and the situation in Anguilla, it seems like there is need for support. And I'd like your thoughts on that, and by what means, in those particular instances, can other overseas territories support, certainly even some of the suggestions for, if you will, due process before draconian measures are taken, certainly would be things that could be, may have been suggested there and certainly could be. But I'd like your thoughts on that. How can we actually help the other overseas territories cross the bridges that they're facing, as we ourselves, who knows, may face those bridges in the future?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Dr. Dawson. And this is an interesting aspect because, as I mentioned, we in the BVI, our constitutional position is akin to what prevails in the Turks and Caicos Islands. I think really the first thing I would say is that we have to ensure that we are always a very good example of good governance. I think that's critical, that's very important. And you see, I've mentioned that, you know, we must have an understanding of the importance of the principles of good governance and the institutions of good governance for ourselves. And we must develop and strengthen those for ourselves. And that includes, of course, fiscal responsibility. And so we must become an example that the other OTs would want to emulate. And you know, the various premiers and so on meet in different forums and so on. And I would like to think that there's some exchange of ideas and information with regard to issues that they are confronting mutually in their respective countries. And so to the extent that there's a good example in one territory that can be emulated in another territory, I think that is one area in which one can help the other. Now, specifically as regards the Turks and Caicos Islands, let us be frank. What prevailed there in terms of these various contracts and so on was nothing short of wrongdoing. And we must always stand for holding people accountable for wrongdoing, particularly of that nature in relation to public matters and public finance, because it's a breach of trust. It's a breach of trust with the people of the country. And so we must always stand for that principle. Now, how they got there over a period of time, and whether the sort of big stick action that was ultimately taken by the United Kingdom government could have been averted, is a matter where the debate rages on. Because there are steps perhaps that could have been taken. It could not be that some of these things were not known. They must have been known to some extent, and the necessary steps should be taken. And that comes back to the whole issue that you mentioned, Carl, about access to information. Because, you know, too often we underscore conducting government in secrecy. But the world has changed. You know, now we want open government. We speak of transparency, we must mean it when we speak of transparency, and hence accountability. In order for there to be transparency, there must be access to information. And so the Freedom of Information Act is a very important act, but I must say one thing about that. It's not an inexpensive piece of legislation to operate. And I believe in the United Kingdom, where they have passed Freedom of Information legislation, it's only been partially introduced in the United Kingdom, I believe I'm correct in saying. And likewise in some other countries, because it calls for a paradigm shift within the public service in order to ensure that there is that level of access to information by the public. So, you know, we cannot, of course, as an overseas territory, you know, necessarily plead the cause of the Turks and Caicos Islands. But as I mentioned, as one of the principles that should underlie a new relationship, a new partnership with the UK, that type of draconian remedy, which is really, you know, in a sense, you know, contrary to the principles of you know, the aspirations of countries and so on, as set out in the United Nations Declaration and whatnot, that you should only be resorted to as a very last resort. In fact, the measures that should have been deployed early on should have ensured that one never has to resort to that kind of draconian step, because it's a serious backward step in a country where you take away that level of autonomy and control over their own affairs. So I think, we have to be a good example ourselves, and we have to ensure that the white paper, as formulated, contains these kind of principles, not just simply to ensure that it doesn't happen to us, but that in relation to good governance, these things are necessary and proper to inform a white paper.
Good evening.
Evening.
I want to associate myself with Dr. Dawson's comments of this being a landmark speech. I want to congratulate you, Sensei Jerry.
Thank you.
I just like to embarrass you like this. For making such a tremendous contribution to the discussion, the constitutional discussion. Tangentially, regarding the Turks and Caicos, was the governor sleeping? Where was the governor when all this was going on? But that's another issue. I'm wondering if the time, based on what you've said tonight, I'm wondering if the time hasn't come for us to start having a discussion about independence. Because it seems to me, based on your lecture, that we need now another constitutional review. We need enhanced autonomy. We need to start looking at more self-governance. Mr. Billingham, in his statement, his policy statement, said that further constitutional discussion is off the table at this particular time with this white paper. He also talked about having BVI Islanders be proud of our British heritage, which, I don't know what a British heritage is. My historical frame of reference is the transatlantic slave trade in the plantation era. So, I don't know what British heritage is talking about. He also talking about, as you mentioned, having the various departments in the UK, and as you rightfully put, oversee the departments in the overseas territories in the BVI. So it seems to me, it sounds like a BVI integration as a province of the UK. Like a UK VI. Like when we say, if you listen to the term British Virgin Islands, and you listen to the term Virgin Islands UK, a British Virgin Islands is like a group of islands in the Caribbean. Virgin Islands UK is like saying London UK, or Huddersfield UK. We are a outpost or province of Britain. So I'm looking, and I'm getting this vibration that there is this desire for the UK not to have any more quote-unquote overseas territories, and if you want to get to the reality of the term, no more colonies, but want to have, if you give you the choice, you're either going to be independent or you're going to be a UK province. And I'm wondering your thoughts on this whole affair, and they actually going over our government here, because in your recommendations to what the questions should have been and how they should be dealt with, I got the inference that they went over our government or elected representatives' head directly to their subjects, us the people, for answers to these questions that should have been answered by persons in authority, persons who have the knowledge to answer these questions. So, all of what you said and all the vibration I'm getting, it says to me, should we be looking seriously at and having a debate and a discussion on being independent or being a UK province or being a UK Virgin Islands? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cromwell, for that somewhat thought-provoking question. Well, you know, the whole issue of independence is one which has come up in successive constitutional reviews. There's usually something, when I say come up, there's something said about it in the actual report. Thus far, consistently, the commissions have said that there is no groundswell of support for moving to independence. And indeed, I think on last night's program, I believe I think it was someone who called in to that program about the consultative process. They said similarly that, you know, they're not talking about moving to independence. And you're correct in the statement. It seems clearly to say that the UK government considers that the overseas territories have, in a sense, maximized the level of autonomy and self-governance that they can expect to get and still remain within the relationship with the United Kingdom. Now, it seems to me that whenever you're having a review of this nature, where a new white paper is being put out, and even where someone in advance says, well, don't expect anything more, you should not resign yourself to believing that, or accepting that you cannot make a legitimate case for more autonomy. And whether that more autonomy ultimately leads the territory to independence, obviously will be a matter for the people of the territory to consider if that question is put to them at the appropriate time in the form of, I believe it has to be by way of a referendum. I think the United Kingdom has clearly stated this years ago, that it has to be by way of a referendum, so that there is a clear declaration by the people that they wish to go independent. So the way I see this is that, you know, there are these dynamics that are in play, and we need to smart up and represent for ourselves what we would like to see and to achieve. And so the process must be a meaningful one. I must say I'm disappointed by the process. I think you gleaned that, because we in the British Virgin Islands came to find out about it rather late. That's the first problem. And secondly, the time frame which was afforded for such an important process and exercise was obviously too short. And the Premier, of course, the new Premier, on his visit to London, had to literally ask for an extension. We understand that there's a short extension. I'm not quite sure how short it is, but it seemed like it might be this month. By the end of this month, we have to get in our views. The process of consulting with the public directly is one which initially concerned me, I must say. And I asked myself, well, why adopt that kind of approach, which is unusual for this type of exercise. You go through the duly elected governments, but you ask that they conduct public consultations and report back the outcome of those consultations. And obviously, you know, Her Majesty's representative in the persons of the governor would be present in the territory, will understand and observe those public consultations for himself or herself, as the case may be. So I was a little surprised of that approach. And I was also surprised in the context of what kind of meaningful responses would you expect to receive generally across the public in terms of this type of process and this type of exercise? And is that the best way to solicit meaningful responses, meaningful views, and so on? And so I have a serious problem with it, apart from, as I mentioned, the vagueness of some of the questions and so on. We we understood very early when we, in fact, even before we embarked upon the constitutional review process, that we had to educate the public with regard to what the existing constitution provided, what constitutions were all about, and what the entire exercise were all about, in order to ensure that the responses and that we got from the public and their participation would be as meaningful and constructive as possible. So there has to be a process of education before you can get that level of response. And it seems to me that there's certainly not sufficient time for even the local government to embark upon that kind of educational process with the public to get a meaningful response. But ultimately, Brother Cromwell, the whole question of independence would be for all of us to decide if and when that issue comes up. I know I've sidestepped the question, but that's my intention anyway.
Good night, thank you. I'm going to ask 3 questions. I'm going to be very brief. One, in terms of good governance, if a citizen like myself, a poor person, having read the Constitution and perceive that there is a breach of the Constitution, and that breach is allowed, well, how does that speak to good governance? One.
Should I answer that? I'll take them as you give them, right? In relation to that, you have your don't sit down, Dr. Scatliffe. In relation to that, you have your access to the courts. That is an important part of the rule of law and good governance. So you go to the courts and you say, well, look, you know, there has been a breach of the Constitution, and I'm seeking redress as a citizen, as a voter in the territory. So there is access to the courts, and that is an important pillar of good governance.
And the second question is a follow-up. How does a poor person like myself afford such financing of the court review of my reference?
Well, I suppose I should accept your classification of your financial status. in the old times they used to speak of landed gentry and so on, so I won't go down that road. But yes, you know, the whole issue of access to the courts and the question of the resources of the person is one that we have to take seriously. That brings us, for example, to the whole question of legal aid in the territory, which is something that we have been, if you excuse my language, we've been pussyfooting around with this for years and years. And I would like to think, though, Dr. Scatliffe, that in your case, as the poor man you've described, that you are likely to find legal representation that are willing to take on your case where one determines, where the advice is that you have a good case.
And the third question is that in terms of good governance, again, you mentioned many mechanisms in terms of government operations and holding government to account, like the PAC, the Board of Inquiry, the Complaints Commissioner, standing orders, etc., etc. How do we go about strengthening these mechanisms to ensure good governance? Right.
Well, that is an important question, because first of all, we have to recognize the shortfalls in those institutions and legislation. And as I said also too in the presentation, there has to be leadership. There has to be the leadership to bring about those changes, because first and foremost, we must demonstrate that we can be self-policing. This is the important thing. If you're running your household, you have to demonstrate that you can run your household. So you have to be self-policing. We must get away from this concept that these principles that are all important and good about governance and so on are principles that somehow should come from outside to us, right? We must recognize the importance of these principles. We must recognize the importance of the institutions of governance that we already have. And we must take the necessary measures to protect and sustain those institutions and ensure a high standard of good governance within the territory for ourselves. Because when you have your house in order, when you're conducting your house in a proper way, no one can come and tell you that you're not.
Good evening. You have to bear with me. I'm not a public speaker. But with the UK, in light of the fact that they promote good governments, good rule of law, how can they go and suspend a constitution for one of their overseas territory? To me, that's just going back to plain colonialism. And I just can't see, if you want us to practice good governance, good law, and those are good qualities, it should be things in those qualities that help us to resolve our negative issues.
Well, thank you for that question. I think my point that I was making really is that we must have the necessary checks and balances and procedures and steps relative to good governance in place, and those must be deployed before there is any resort to suspending our constitution, which is quite a retrogressive step to take. I suppose, in a sense, being devil's advocate, the British government will say that resorting to that ultimate nuclear weapon, so to speak, became necessary because of the level of bad governance within the Turks and Caicos. It had gotten so bad. But my issue is that it ought not to have been allowed to get to that point. And first, if we hold our own leaders accountable, then we are likely to ensure that that nuclear weapon doesn't have to be deployed. And if we uphold the principles that we hold there, then it is likely that that nuclear weapon will not be deployed. But ultimately, we have to recognize that our current constitutional status permits of that to be done, because really, you know, when we speak of our constitution, it's an order in council that is made under the West Indies, the powers under to Her Majesty under the West Indies Act. And I don't want to liken it to an order in council made by our own government in the Virgin Islands, because that in a sense would be demeaning our constitution. But in terms of its amendment, in terms of its revocation, in terms of its suspension, that reserve power still rests with Her Majesty. And we have to accept that that is where we are, because that is where we have chosen to be. And if ultimately we want to ensure that that doesn't happen, the only thing you can do ultimately to ensure that that cannot happen is become an independent territory, as Cromwell was alluding to early on. But I would like to think still that, and I did suggest that some of the reserve powers of Her Majesty must only be exercised in certain circumstances as a matter of principle. Of course, I think issue will be taken with that to say, well, you cannot circumscribe Her Majesty's exercise of her powers. And, you know, we'll have to differ about that. But I really think that, you know, it's a backward step. It's one which we in the other OTs, I think, looked upon, I would like to think, and say, well, you know, it's a pity that that was done, because it was something that, you know, we're all looking forward, and that was a very backward-looking move.
Jerry, I support what has been said by many of the persons who have risen. It was an excellent presentation. But I also remember Dr. Archibald some time ago in this auditorium, and he was suggesting, I think, that within the Constitution, perhaps a provision could have been made for the control of expenditure. I think he mentioned that quite some time ago. He's not here. He's probably a step back. Because when you look at that must have been quite a long time ago, maybe 7, 8 more years ago. But the whole thing has come full circle, because the Caribbean is one of the regions that is most indebted. You know, if you look at all the regions in the world, we are among the most indebted nations in the world. So clearly, there is a need for fiscal responsibility, and there is a need for us to manage our finances well. And we should be taking the initiative to do that, and we should be advised also where we need advice. Having said that, it seems to me, and I think you may have alluded to it, when you said the Partnership for Progress partnership began with the Montserrat event.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because what we're looking at here is perhaps Britain's concern about risk mitigation, right? It's looking at perhaps things like reputational risk. It's looking at things like catastrophic risk. It's looking at things like financial risk. So it's looking at how best it can manage these potential risks, particularly in the current environment that we are in. And therefore you have things like the contingent liability. We also have to look at the history of actual liability versus contingent liability and see how that has evolved over time and the extent to which these actions may be draconian, maybe sufficient or inefficient. Example, you go back to Gibraltar when the United Kingdom had to, in fact, take care of the pensions from Spain in terms of the citizens there in Gibraltar. There was a pension issue. There was a Falklands issue. Those are actual liabilities that have actually emerged. There are not a whole lot of them, but they have, in fact, emerged. In our particular situation, though, here in the BVI, we do have to follow the terms of good governance, and those terms of good governance need not only apply in terms of politically or within the areas of government, but also in the private sector. I mean, you look at the way governance rules also apply to the private sector as boards are managed. So the concept of good governance is one that is pervasive and one that should be embraced and welcomed. I've said all of that to say that we are not likely to become independent because most people feel that it's anathema. We've seen it tried in Bermuda. We've seen they've had many reviews and they have not accepted it because there is a fear that you may be like one of the other islands. You're not as sufficiently well off. You're better off than most of the other countries economically, and people fear losing that level of prosperity, which somehow they link to their political status. But ultimately, I think we have got to learn to manage our resources and not have a maternal relationship with Britain, but one more of mutual respect. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those comments, Freddie, a lot of which I concur. You know, in a sense, not all the OTs are on the same level. And I think the 1999 white paper alluded to that, and even the statement by Mr. Haig also alludes to that they recognize that, you know, not all the OTs are the same, and the application of whatever comes out has to be different in relation to each of the overseas territories. But, you know, it's really what I was saying before. We have to police ourselves. We have to hold ourselves to high standards. We have to protect the things that are dear to us and that make our society democratic and functioning with the protections that are in place. And we have to, from time to time, improve upon that whole system for governance and make the necessary changes in our own interest. And ultimately, I think people are concerned about the quality of life that they enjoy. They may not be too concerned or hung up on the question of the constitutional or international status of the territory, whether we should be independent or not. I think primarily people are concerned about quality of life, the level of prosperity and so on enjoyed by the territory, and how we prepare for the future and how generations to come will have a significant role to play and to continue to play in the development of the territory and the economy of the territory. So I think those are some of the things that we ought to focus on and we ought to not lose sight of.
Good evening.
Shana.
The good Mr. Reimer yielded 1 minute. I just wanted to say to Mr. Ferrara, thank you for a very enlightening presentation. I was talking to Troy and we both agreed that a lot of things that was said tonight, from the introduction straight up to comments being made, our generation, our peers, I wish more of them were here to hear, this valuable information, because it's really the charge is going to come to us to have and take those things that you've presented tonight and make them a reality as far as where we go with the future of our country. And, it highlighted for me that the whole topic of civics is something we need to put back into our education system to make sure that our people are, they are enlightened, not just educated, but they are fully aware of what it is, because I agree with you that no one could participate on the level of the discussion with those questions that were put up there in the public domain in any meaningful way without that education process. I had one question, or two questions. One, will the presentation be published? Because I think this is something that needs to be put out into the public domain as much as possible, in addition to the broadcast. And I'm concerned about the West Indies Act, because this is the first I'm hearing about it now with this whole process. And is there anything else in there that we should be concerned about? Because it's like it came out of the blue. Again, because, even in Caribbean history, I cannot recall hearing about the West Indies Act. And it is something that, because that has such a profound impact, I can wake up one morning and everything has just stopped, as far as I know it, and just a comment in terms of the public service, the points that you've made. I think our main challenge as a country is discipline. I was in government for 8 years. I was on many committees that dealt with developing strategic plans. Every challenge that we have, we know exactly what it is we need to do, or we have a very good idea of it. The question is, we need to man up and do what it is we need to do in the best interest of our country, and stop playing politics with it. Because a lot of times decisions are made, political interests are put first before our country, and we are suffering because of the consequences of it. Because fiscal management, we've been talking about financial management reform for probably over 10 years. So there should be no reason why we don't have auditor reports, we don't have the statistics, we don't have the development plans that we need to have in place. So, I'm happy to hear this discussion, and I hope that the foundation continues this conversation, as an ongoing something, and that we really need to push. So the West Indies Act, that's my concern.
Well, thank you very much, Shana, for those kind comments and so on. I agree with you. Well, the West Indies Act is a piece of legislation that we ought to be familiar with, because it does affect us. I think if you look at the Constitution, I have my copy here. If you look at the Constitution, you will see that right at the very beginning, it says, Her Majesty, in exercise of the powers conferred upon her by Sections 5 and 7 of the West Indies Act, 1962, and of all other powers enabling her to do so, is pleased by the advice of her Privy Council to order, and it is ordered as follows, and therefore we have the Constitution. So it's an important piece of legislation, but I think it's easily accessible. We can make that available. Yeah. In terms of the availability of the lecture, yes, I will certainly make it available for public dissemination to whoever wish a copy. I'll make the requisite copies and have them available.
Mr. Chairman, I hope I'm not breaking your rules. I have a very short question. That is, from where I sit, it appears that good governance, it is something that a good government delivers. Well, I would think that it's rather one-sided. Have you thought that perhaps it would help a constitution to balance the rights of citizens with responsibility of citizens? Thank you.
Yes, well, that's a very, very important point you've raised, Captain Sala, because, you know, with rights also comes responsibilities. And we have to be fully cognizant of this, that if you put it in the context of autonomy and greater self-governance, the extent to which we are able to make advancements in these areas, yes, it gives greater authority and power, so to speak, but with that comes a greater responsibility. And we have to recognize that we must indeed balance the two, and we must discharge both of them. And it's not just simply a matter of saying, well, this is my right. If you look at, as another example, the human rights chapter, you know, freedom of expression, etc., etc., those rights are limited to the extent that they may conflict with a similar right that another citizen has. So there is no absolute right in the context of you have the right to, you know, do or say whatever you want. There are limitations on those rights, and so there are responsibilities and, in some instances, in a sense, penalties for violation. I think His Excellency.
Your Excellency, and then Mr. Reimer, if you wish, and then we'll conclude.
I wasn't going to speak because I think this is a fascinating discussion, and I congratulate you, Jerry, on having given such a masterful survey of both the history and the opportunities which are now presented by this debate about the future of the relationship between the territories and the UK government. I congratulate not just on the comprehensive nature of that survey, but also on the thought that's been put into setting out principles and responding to the questions. I think it's legitimate to ask how those questions were formulated and how they were presented. And of course, it was unfortunate that the consultation process was launched almost at the same time as the election was announced here in the BVI, and that was not by intention of the government in London, I know, and some consideration was given as to whether it might be changed, but in the end it was decided that if they were to delay the process, it might coincide with an election in another overseas territory, and therefore you might never have had the consultation which is currently taking place. So it was unfortunate, but just commenting on the time frame, actually, the consultation was launched back in September. I think I wrote to you and about 100 other stakeholders, opinion formers across the public and private sector back at that stage, inviting comments, and those comments were invited up until the end of December. In parallel, however, with that public consultation process, there was also a consultation of the government. It's not as though the British government was going just to the people and avoiding seeking the views of the government in individual territories. There was a parallel approach made to governments, and governments were given the opportunity to respond to that approach. It's true that the government here has now asked for an opportunity to, having established itself in power, and obviously the elections were something of a distraction here, the government here has asked if it could have a bit more time to feed into the process, and have been told that that is possible. But I very much welcome what's happened here today. I very much welcome the way in which there was a debate on the radio last night, and I would very much encourage you and anyone else who has a serious stake in this process or a serious input to make that input at this point, so that it can be fed back in sufficient time to be taken into account as the as the UK government considers the next steps. So I could comment on lots of what you said. I agree with most of it. I won't agree with every single word. You wouldn't expect me to. But perhaps just a word about the Turks and Caicos. I wasn't around when the governor was sleeping or whatever happened in the process leading up to the resumption of power by the UK government, the UK authorities, or by the governor. I am sure that certain attempts were made to try and avoid the situation which arose, although I can't spell out what those might have been in detail. It's not the UK government's intention to repeat that. In fact, one of the things which you might have read from Mr. Haig's statement was that the last thing the UK government wants to do is to have a repeat of the Turks and Caicos. And to avoid a repeat of the Turks and Caicos, I think, taking up your own point, it's critically important for the territories to take their own responsibility for improving the quality of governance. And I think that many of the suggestions you've made, I would agree with wholeheartedly. If you read the speech from the throne, which I delivered a few weeks ago, you'll find quite a lot of those references picked up, references to freedom of information, references to the Register of Interests Act, and so on. They're all there, references to the need to implement the human rights provisions of the 2007 Constitution, which haven't yet been put in place. So I warmly welcome what you're suggesting here. But the UK government has no intention of driving territories into a situation where they intervene, where they suspend constitutions. They don't want to do that. They want to ensure that good governance happens because it's right for good governance to take place. So that's just really what I would say about the Turks and Caicos. And the government in the UK has also committed itself to restoring elected government in the Turks and Caicos as soon as certain milestones are met. And many of those milestones are in the process of being met now. So the intention is that the Constitution should be restored as soon as practically possible. Thanks very much indeed, and I hope you, if you haven't already made your contribution to the process of consultation, that you will do so either directly or through the BVI government's current process. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your comments. I would say that in working on the paper, I intended this to be my contribution to that process. So I think I mentioned earlier that I will make a copy available to you, and I think I will also make one available to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
That'd be great. Thank you very much indeed.
So,
thanks.
Elia?
Good evening. I'd also like to be associated with the compliments paid to you, Jerry, Mr. Ferrara. I think it was indeed quite a good talk and did bring out some very important issues. But just to be a little humorous, I also thought I would say that maybe the approach that the UK took in consultation was maybe they were making a point. They were speaking to their citizens. After all, you know, we all have British passports, so maybe they felt they could approach directly. But that's not really to let the UK off the hook. I think really and truly, what was allowed to happen, the UK has to accept complete responsibility for the failure in their mandate to the territories. They should not have allowed that stage to be reached. And indeed, I believe they dropped the ball. And we, I agree with you, must make sure that we behaved in such a way that this would not happen to us. But I believe that the UK government must accept full responsibility for the deterioration of governance in the territories. They should not have allowed, given their mandate, that degree of deterioration, and it's general throughout their Caribbean territories. So, I mean, it shows the weakness on the part of the UK in its mandate to the territories.
Thank you very much. I will just make 3 very brief points. The first is to say how proud I am of the Frederick Pickering Memorial Foundation for having had this lecture tonight. It's 24th. And I will say publicly to my colleagues of the foundation that one of my own hopes for our silver anniversary next year is that we will be able to publish what will be the 25 lectures, hopefully, that we will have had by that time. That's my first point. Secondly, I wish to sincerely commend you, my friend and learned colleague, Jerry Ferrara, for an extremely important, very expansive, very thorough presentation. Extremely important, well presented, and I know, although it took, by my reckoning, 1 hour and 20 minutes to deliver, it was many, many more hours of work. Thank you very much for doing it. My third point is a little more substantive, and it is a comment in relation to the point you made, Jerry, and somewhat in amplification of your point on the legislative body in our country, properly referred to in the Constitution as the legislature. And to make a couple of points, the first of which is that the legislature, the legislative branch of government, is not only the House of Assembly. We often tend to forget that it is Her Majesty the Queen, as represented by His Excellency the Governor, and the House of Assembly. I think all too often we forget that. And in consequence of that, there are what I think you would have characterized, given the way you made your points earlier, as limitations on the House of Assembly. Specifically, even though the House of Assembly passes laws and may pass a particular law, it is not law until it is assented to by the governor and also until it is brought into force. And my own experience is that increasingly governors do not treat it as a perfunctory role. It used to be that once the House of Assembly had passed a piece of legislation, the Attorney General had advised that it was in order, the governor would assent. My experience is that they now get into what the law says and whether they should assent or not. I have a legal view on that, which I will not express tonight. But the other important point I want to make is that there is still the provision in our Constitution of the power of disallowance by the United Kingdom government of laws passed by the House of Assembly, and that is not academic. When in 1997 we had a criminal code as a bill before the House of Assembly, and I was piloting that bill through the House as Attorney General, the Foreign Office was very clear in stating that they would advise the exercise of the power of disallowance if we did not take out of the bill a provision which made homosexual acts between consenting males a crime. So when I heard Shana speak and mention the West Indies Act and so on, I think there is so much that we generally are not aware of. And very unfortunately, in my considered but humble view, our country has deteriorated into mere quests for power instead of empowerment of people. And certainly it is important, and your lecture has done so much tonight, in my view, along that road, of really letting our people know what our realities of government and governance are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben Sear, for your comments and also your contribution. Your points are well made and they serve to underscore the status that we are and the reality of that status. And as you say, those powers are not merely academic. They can be used, and having certain limited instances, they have been used. and we need to bear that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a most engaging audience, wonderful audience. We are winding down now. Would you join me once again, please, in a round of applause for Attorney Jerry Ferrara.